What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and welcome back to the Rumor Roundup, our weekly series where we run over all the news and rumors and tidbits and all the stuff you may have missed over the course of the week. And we have a big episode today. Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But before we get into that, kind of a crazy thing, and I feel like everybody saw this coming. Marvel and DC are supposedly gonna have no role in San Diego Comic-Con in 2021, instead opting to host their own events. And this makes sense, right? San Diego is gonna be an all virtual event this year, kind of the tail end of what's going on with cons going into the post-COVID landscape. I imagine by next year, everything will basically be back to normal. And I think maybe there's a handful of cons here and there going to be doing in-person events, but with San Diego, it makes a lot of sense. It's the biggest comic book convention in the world that's not associated with anime. The anime cons are the biggest ones, but the Comic-Con scene, San Diego's where it's at, although arguably, I think New York is as big, if not bigger. The important thing is they're going to be hosting their own events here, and I feel like a lot of companies are going in that direction. We talked last week, or maybe the week before, how a lot of the video game companies that are out there are not really taking part in events like E3. Instead, they're launching their own events. Maybe it's cheaper, I'm not entirely sure, but it kind of sucks. I feel like, you know, the whole Hall H event and the idea of San Diego and Marvel goes in there and makes their announcements and DC goes in there and makes their announcements, all that kind of stuff. It's just kind of a pastime, right? It's one of the things that you look forward to when it comes to the comic book convention. So it's going to be disappointing, but at the end of the day, I guess it's just par for the course. But the next bit of news here, this is kind of a crazy thing. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is no longer inking these huge contracts with actors and actresses. Specifically, they cited Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth, but I imagine they also included Robert Downey Jr. Now, I think RDJ is a bit of a special case here because the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was in large part built on the shoulders of Robert Downey Jr., right? The success of Iron Man is what led to all the other franchises that came after. Now, that's not to say that Chris Evans, Chris Hemsworth, all those different actors, Bradley Cooper as Rocket Raccoon, Vin Diesel as Groot, literally saying 3 lines throughout the entirety of his whole Marvel Cinematic Universe appearances. It's not to say they didn't contribute anything to the MCU, but we can all kind of agree, had it not been for Robert Downey Jr., specifically his portrayal of Tony Stark, which I would say is the role he was born for, we wouldn't really have the MCU as it exists. But there also are huge limitations there. Money that could be spent on hiring a particular actor is money that could actually be spent hiring multiple actors. Now, this really begs the question, are we going to see these great, big, huge, long appearances? Are we going to see people like Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth in the future of the MCU, right? Angelina Jolie, for example, is going to be in Eternals. Are we going to see her in the MCU for the next 10 years? Or are they going to get rid of her character in about 5 years and just move on to the next one? One of the things to know when it comes to the MCU, everything you've seen over the last 10 or so years has been the very tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. They haven't even gotten to the X-Men yet, and there are a mountain of characters they can use there. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, if we're being honest with ourselves, can make movies for the next 100 years, just based on the entirety of the Marvel roster, and even then they would just be getting started, right? So they can make movies forever. At the end of the day, the length of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's success doesn't really have so much to do with the characters so much as the general public's interest in their movies. That will really determine the livelihood and the length of how long the MCU goes on for. But moving away from comic books for a second and talking a little bit about gaming here, some poor soul donated Air Raid by accident to Goodwill, or at least supposedly by accident. Why does this matter? Air Raid was an old Atari game, and there were less than 30 of them made. This game, in pristine condition, is worth about 10 grand, and in fact, it's sold for about 11 grand at auction by Goodwill. That person has to be kicking themselves. Not the most significant thing in the world, but I just kind of felt like that needed to be talked about. If you guys are going to donate stuff, make sure you check the value of the things you're donating. There's nothing wrong with donating high value items that can be sold by charity centers for a good chunk of change. They need it, right? Those people, those organizations, aside from Goodwill, more of the local places run on a shoestring budget. So any kind of charitable donations they can get that can help bolster their budgets and increase their finances is always a good thing. You just don't want to be the person who does it by accident. Don't be the person who donates a $10,000 game and then kicks yourself for not really looking up the value of it. Now, most likely it was just some grandma who donated all of her kids' Atari stuff or whatever it is. Who really knows, right? I feel like old people don't really have an understanding of the value of stuff like Atari games and what they're worth now versus the 10 cents they paid for them at the time that they came out. I don't really know. But regardless, it's one of those weird and wonky circumstances. But one of the other things that we found out here is that the new Assassin's Creed game is going to be a live service game. I'm going to be honest with you guys. guys, I miss the days when I could just go to the store, buy a game, and I got the whole package in the game itself. I understand that game makers are creating games for like shareholders and the stock market. They're not really making it for the gaming community. I mean, I guess they are insofar as like we're buying them, but their job and their goal is to appease shareholders first and then gamers second. And having this whole system set up where I'm basically being nickel and dimed after I pay $60 to $70 for a game kind of pisses me off. It's one of the reasons why I stopped playing Destiny. I'm really tired of that. And I don't want to turn this into a great big huge tirade just railing against games as a service, but I think it's high time that we just stop participating in that, right? Stop participating in this idea of games as a service and saying, okay, we're gonna pay $60 for the base game, and then by the time we get all the expansions, we've paid about $200. I think it's a huge, colossal waste, right? The best way to combat that is to show game developers we're not buying into that nonsense and basically stop partaking in it. One of the last little announcements we have here for the gaming scene, and I'm not really sure how to feel about this, Death Stranding is getting a PS5 port, and much like Ghost of Tsushima, it's getting a director's cut, which basically means additional content. The game Death Stranding was gorgeous, but I was bored out of my mind. It was just so slow. And I understand that Hideo Kojima games are designed to be like that, right? They're designed to tell a story more than focus on the gameplay. The story was great and it was fantastic, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't really able to hold my interest. I kind of had to force myself through it. But at the end of the day, I'm just not a big fan of it, right? It's just way too slow. I have ADHD, man. I like games that are fast-paced. I like it when things happen, but regardless, as beautiful as it was on the PS4, I can only imagine how it's gonna look on the PS5. That game, I think, will really highlight what the PS5 is capable of. But at the end of the day, we'll just kind of have to wait and see and find out. But getting into our final bit of an announcement here, of course, Hugh Jackman, Kevin Feige, all that kind of stuff. The Black Widow movie comes out at the time of this recording. I have not seen it yet, but I am excited to see it. I'm curious to see what they do with Taskmaster. Those of you guys who don't know, Tony Masters is the premier fighter in Marvel Comics, right? This guy was technically born with muscle memory, so he can see people do a thing and then he just remembers it. And so he was able to watch Captain America fight or watch somebody like Shang-Chi fight, and the longer he fights someone, the more he begins to mimic their style. This was expanded upon with a serum that he took, which actually enhanced his ability to do this, where he could do it much, much faster. But the cool thing about Taskmaster is if he gets into a fight with Captain America, the longer they fight, the more he'll be able to copy his fighting style, all the way to the point that he'll actually know what Captain America is gonna do before he does it, kind of a precognition of sorts. I'm curious to see how they roll the character over into the Black Widow film. If I'm a betting man, it's probably not gonna be Tony Masters. The Black Widow film has largely come across as something akin to Wonder Woman, where it's largely a woman-centric film, which I think is awesome. And so they'll probably end up turning Tony Masters into a woman as opposed to a guy. Now, whether or not it's still the whole idea of like a muscle memory type thing, I don't really know. I think it's gonna be cool to see a person fighting Black Widow, Red Guardian, and so on, who basically switches between the fighting styles of different people. Iron Man, maybe. I don't think Iron Man really has a fighting style. Assuming the Taskmaster has seen Black Panther fight, he could switch into that fighting style. So go from like Captain America to Black Panther to Spider-Man and just kind of switch around all over the place to the point that the fighting style is incredibly confusing for anybody who's facing off against it, and that's what gives them the upper hand. But for our big discussion here, right, our biggest rumor of the day, right, Hugh Jackman, Kevin Feige, Wolverine in the MCU. We know it's only a matter of time before Wolverine shows up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but what's been happening here is that Hugh Jackman has been basically adding a whole bunch of images to his Instagram account that show like Wolverine, right? That basically say like, this is Wolverine, his claws, different things like that, and then having a whole bunch of pictures with Kevin Feige. It's one of these things that we've seen happen before. We saw this when Chris Evans was gonna play Captain America, but he wasn't officially cast. We saw it when Chris Hemsworth was gonna play Thor, he was not officially cast. We saw that with different scenarios. Dave Bautista and Drax the Destroyer, that these actors and actresses would come out and they would show these images on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, even if they use that, I don't really know, but they would show these images on their social media platforms that basically hinted at the idea that like a thing is coming. And it's only in rational hindsight that it was like, yeah, they were telling us they were gonna play that character, awesome. And so using that hindsight and applying it to this, all arrows point to the fact that somehow or another, Disney managed to get Hugh Jackman to come back as Wolverine in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I gotta tell you, if we get Hugh Jackman in the MCU as Wolverine, all will be right with the world. Because I gotta be honest, right? I understand he played the character for 17 years. I understand he's old. He can't play the character forever. They'll most likely go with somebody who's young if they don't bring in Hugh Jackman that can play the role of Wolverine for quite some time. Because let's be honest with ourselves, Wolverine movies in the MCU, that's a license to print money. And so at that point, they would need somebody who could play the role for a long, long time. But Hugh Jackman is Wolverine, man. Like, I can't see him as anybody else. And I can't see anybody else playing Wolverine besides Hugh Jackman. He was so good at it, especially coming out of Logan. Logan was the best of the Wolverine films, right? Probably the best depiction of Wolverine in any of the Fox X-Men films, right? It was just an incredible movie. You know, it was drama and it was action and it was just great storytelling. It was beautifully shot. Of course, we also know that Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool is going to appear in the MCU. We know that Deadpool 3 is going to be rated R. And as far as we know from what Kevin Feige told us, it's the only movie that's coming into the MCU that's going to be rated R, largely just because of the fact that, you know, Deadpool's successful. Nobody wants to see a PG-13 movie. Everybody wants to see an R-rated Deadpool. So at that point, the general public forced the hand of Marvel Studios and Disney. But seeing Hugh Jackman cross over with Ryan Reynolds, it just screams perfection. Just and I really feel like this is something that we just need to see, right? It just needs to happen. But with that being said, guys, that's our episode for this week. Let us know down in the comments if there's any news that you think we missed that we should talk about, and we will catch you all later. Peace.